Hello and welcome to Autistic Changeling. So, a couple of videos ago, like a month or more ago, I had my mom on the channel, and at one point I mentioned the first time I learned about autism and autistic people, and how there was a story behind it that I was going to get into in a later video. So I figured, let's do that today, take a break from the educational videos for some embarrassing stories about me when I was 13. Alright, so the first context in which I learned about autistic people was related to New Age spirituality stuff, which I had a pretty big special interest in when I was like 11 to 13 years old. Now you have to put this in context, okay? I was like 12-ish. Had a very strong interest in fantasy in general and spirituality in general, not just New Age spirituality, but like mostly focusing on that. But I also didn't have a great grasp of like putting that in the broader context of real life. And anyways, there may have been some incidents where I really thought that if I like jumped the right way with the garbage bag, I could fly. I kept hoping, but it didn't happen, obviously, or I would be doing something much more interesting than making YouTube videos. You would already know about me if I could fly, trust me. I would not keep it secret if I had special powers. Anyways, so that's the context in which I found out about autistic people, but I didn't really learn anything about autism or autistic people because the context in which I learned about this was the concept of crystal children and indigo adults and that sort of thing. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. I'm not really sure if this is still a big thing. It was fairly big, well, big in a very niche spirituality circles, still kind of small, but it was bigger, I think, when I was like 12. I'm not sure how that whole community is doing. I have not been involved in that since I was 13. I did do a brief Google search before I made this video, and there are still relatively new-ish pages talking about it, and apparently the old forum I used to frequent still exists, although thankfully my user profile does not seem to still exist. That would be embarrassing. But yeah, so it does still seem to exist in some circles. And before I go any further with this video, I do want to say that I'm really not trying to mock anybody's religion or spirituality here. I'm more going to talk about the implications of the way this concept talks about autistic people, and how I view that as an autistic person, rather than the actual spiritual concepts involved in these communities as a whole, because I'm pagan, so it would be very hypocritical of me to mock other people's spirituality for being weird. And my embarrassment at myself when I was 13 is because who isn't embarrassing when they're 13, honestly? So let's move on. So if anybody's not familiar with it, the concept of crystal children and indigo children, and I think there's also some other ones like rainbow and star seeds tend to get mixed into this as well. So all of these concepts together, basically the idea as I remember it is that there's new waves or generations of people who are going to change the world and have higher levels of spiritual awareness and that sort of thing. And these concepts tend to go with the idea that the first group was indigo, and they're mostly adults, and then the second group is crystal, and they're mostly children, although the ages at which these switch off are sort of different depending on who's talking about it. And I'm not sure if people are more like, oh, indigos are young, like crystals are young adults now, because, you know, when I was 12, they were children, so I'm not sure exactly if it's been updated as time moved on. But when I was 12, the concept was that crystals were children and indigos were adults, and they were different personalities ascribed to each of these groups of people, where indigos were seen to be very counter-authority, creative, eccentric, and crystals were seen to be very naive and spiritually blissful and loving. And the reason that this is relevant to autism is that one of the things that always showed up on the checklists for you might be X if was that indigos were often supposed to be ADHD and crystals were supposed to be autistic. And I'm not going to talk too much about the indigo side of this because I feel like it is a little different, because indigos were supposed to be adults, which means that most of the people talking about indigo adults were people who thought they were indigo adults. And that means that whether or not these people had ADHD and how they felt about that is really up to them, because they're adults making their own decisions about what words to use for themselves. And I think that's a little different, because what I want to talk about with respect to the crystal children here specifically is that, with some exceptions, because there were some adults who identified as like early harbingers of the crystal generation or whatever, with some exceptions, a lot of people talking about the crystal children specifically were parents of autistic children who were not autistic and who believed their children were crystal children, which I think is a very different situation, and that situation specifically is what makes me a little uncomfortable here, because the language used to talk about crystal children was, and probably still is, sort of not dehumanizing necessarily, but maybe a little bit of inspiration porn, which, if you're not familiar with that term, I'm going to link to an excellent TED Talk that discusses it and introduces the concept. But basically, it's the idea that disabled people are inspiring and exceptional for not really doing anything other than existing. So there's a little bit of that in here, and there's a little bit of condescension and some of those stereotypes from movies where the autistic kid is like super naive and has magical powers and is just very not human. It is dehumanizing, I guess, to some extent. It feels like it's putting the autistic person on a pedestal where they're supposed to be better than humanity, and at the same time removing them from humanity in a very specific way. And I have concerns that parents who see their children in this stereotype may try to treat their children as though they should be a certain way, and may put pressures on their kids that maybe their kids shouldn't have placed on them. And additionally, I feel like there's an element of your kid isn't disabled, they're a crystal child in some of this, which is concerning to me because, being autistic is a disability, and it's important to be able to recognize that, and telling a disabled person they shouldn't be disabled is a very quick way to cause them pain and frustration in their lives. So those are some of the things that concern me a little with regards to this phenomenon. Additionally, I think that there's several different ways people approach and look at this concept. So I've seen people talk about it as though some crystal children are autistic, but not all, like it's a Venn diagram that overlaps a little. And I think that's probably the best way to look at it. Where it's sort of like with the trans community, where trans people might be more likely to be autistic and autistic people might be more likely to be trans, but it's certainly not a one-to-one relation, and you can't say that all autistic people are trans or all trans people are autistic, because that's just blatantly untrue. It's just a correlation. I think that would be probably the least problematic way to talk about it, and I don't have as much of an issue with that, as long as the other concerns that I mentioned are, people being aware of them and not falling into those things. But I have also seen people say that the crystal children are misdiagnosed as autistic and aren't really autistic, they're crystal children instead. And but that's a way of looking at it that does seem like it's inviting trouble to me. it feels to me like that's going to cause problems when you expect your child to not really act autistic in some situations, and then they are, because they are autistic. And if you can't accept that, that's probably going to cause difficulties between you and your child. And difficulties for your child if you won't get them the accommodations they need because a crystal child shouldn't need them. I can see potential for difficulties with that. So I do have some concerns about this phenomenon, like I've said, and I do think that people who are involved in this community should be careful to avoid these traps and pitfalls in their discussions. I don't think it's necessarily inherently bad for this spiritual concept to exist. In general, just the idea of waves of people with specific traits or whatever. But I do think that tying it specifically to types of neurodivergencies is asking for trouble and perpetuating some stereotyping and negative beliefs. And in addition, I think the concept that that crystal children are the newest wave and are all children is infantilizing by making it seem like all of the crystal children are children and young. But like I said, there are some people who do acknowledge exceptions to that. But I also think that it perpetuates the stereotype that autistic people only exist now and that autism is this new thing, which is not true. You know, yes, the words for autistic people are new, the community is new, but autistic people didn't just magically appear once we had a word. You know, autistic people have existed throughout history, just without the words to say that. And I feel like this really plays into that concept that there's this epidemic and it's new and autistic people are just suddenly coming out of nowhere. And I think that might be in part what causes this sort of an idea to exist. But autistic people have always been here. We didn't just magically pop out of thin air once someone decided there should be a word for us. And I think that it does autistic people throughout history a disservice to assume that they didn't exist. So, in general, my thoughts on the concept of indigo and crystal children and adults and whatnot is that, you know, I think there's probably a way to look at it that isn't problematic, but I think there's a lot of potential for difficulties and ableism and stereotyping. And I think that the concept should be treated carefully because I think there is a lot of potential for pitfalls. And I'm sure that there are some people with those neurodivergencies in the community. Like I said, I'm not going to touch on the indigo concept too much here because I think that's the one that's more likely to have people in it who genuinely are ADHD, and how they feel about the community is not really my place to say. And I wasn't really involved as much in that when I was frequenting the forums as a 12-year-old who probably lied about my age to get in. But that's what I noticed, and of course I didn't notice it in that context when I was 12. When I was 12, I was primarily concerned with trying to develop special magical powers that did not happen. But those are things that I noticed, and then when I'm thinking about them now as an adult, that's what stands out to me and how I feel about it now that I'm older. When I was a child, I noticed the word autism showing up on the checklists, and that's really all I noticed. People didn't really talk too much about autism in those forums. They mentioned it on the checklist, and there would be some people saying things here and there, but it didn't really come up a great deal. But I still think that the underlying ideas I discussed were present, even if I didn't notice them at the time. So, you know, if you have any thoughts about this, if you've been involved with either of these communities, and you're autistic or ADHD, feel free to let me know what you think in the comments. If you have anything you'd like me to discuss in an upcoming video, feel free to let me know. I'll consider doing a video about it if you have any questions or topics you want to know more about. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope you have a great day.